RUSI New South Wales is an independent, apolitical, not-for-profit public education institute that, since 1888, has been promoting informed debate on and enhancing public awareness and understanding of defence and national security issues. We are Australia's oldest think tank. We conduct monthly lectures and seminars, issue a monthly newsletter, provide research support through our extensive military and historical library located in the Anzac Memorial in Sydney's Hyde Park, and together with RUSI Australia, publish a national quarterly magazine called United Service, with informed articles addressing the latest defence and security issues.
Please note, this monthly update presents the geostrategic situation as at the 9th of September 2025. Please be aware that these reports are time-sensitive as these are rapidly changing events. Russo-Ukrainian War. There is still no end in sight to the Russo-Ukrainian War, which has been ongoing at various levels of intensity for over 11 years and has seen Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, suspicious of Russia's longer-term intentions, join NATO, and Ukraine apply to do so, although its application has been deferred while the war is in progress. With wavering among some NATO members, Britain and France are developing a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine. The United States, however, remains the key to resolving the diplomatic deadlock as it is the only nation with the military resources of weapons, ammunition, and other war material to keep Ukraine in the war. Ukraine's European allies, while promising support, lack the military-industrial capacity to sustain the fighting. Now halfway through the fourth year of continuous heavy fighting since Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion, Ukraine is struggling with recruiting frontline fighters and sustaining the levels of artillery, air defense, and small arms ammunition needed at current rates of usage. This is despite its cutting-edge scientific and technological innovation and manufacture of missiles and drones, of which it is now a world leader. Russia itself and Russian oligarchs, however, have suffered under Western sanctions imposed since the 2022 invasion. The Russian economy has been forced onto a war footing, and action is on foot in the West to sell some of the Russian assets seized and frozen in Europe, and the United States to help pay for assistance being provided to Ukraine. China and India, in particular, though, are supporting the Russian economy by purchasing Russian oil and other goods. Against this background, and increasingly frustrated by President Vladimir Putin's intransigence, President Donald Trump warned Putin in late July that, if Russia did not agree to plans for a ceasefire by the 8th of August, Trump would impose high tariffs on countries breaking the Western trade embargo on Russia. When Trump had not received a satisfactory response from Putin by his deadline, Trump imposed a 25% tariff to begin on the 27th of August on Indian goods sold to the United States on top of a 25% tariff already in place. A similar additional tariff, however, was not placed on China, which purchases more oil from Russia than India does. Presidents Putin and Trump met in Alaska on the 15th of August to discuss options for long-term peace in Ukraine. Putin did not agree to President Volodymyr Zelensky also attending. At the meeting, Putin convinced Trump that no ceasefire was necessary before peace talks commence. Consequently, Trump did not follow through with direct sanctions on Russia as he had threatened. Trump, however, continued with the sanctions on India, which came into effect on the 27th of August. Trump also met with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and key European leaders on the 18th of August, but the summit yielded few details of what a Russia-Ukraine truce might look like. While European leaders continued to seek a ceasefire before talks commence, Trump questioned its necessity. There was, however, unanimous support for a trilateral meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin, although Putin has long resisted such a gathering. Notably, Trump signaled a willingness to provide long-term U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine, but he did not explain what form those guarantees would take. Such guarantees have long been seen as a necessity to deter a future Russian invasion. President Emmanuel Macron of France, as co-chair of the European Coalition of the Willing, announced on the 4th of September that the coalition had agreed to deploy a reassurance force in Ukraine after the war ends, essentially land, sea, and air forces to enforce a ceasefire, and that 26 European countries had pledged to provide troops to the force. The coalition hopes the US will provide air and logistic support to the force, although Trump has indicated that there would be no US troops on the ground in Ukraine. President Putin warned on the 5th of September that any Western troops deployed to Ukraine would be regarded by Moscow as legitimate targets to attack. Concurrently, European leaders also pledged more weapons and financial help, including Patriot missile air defense systems, while the Trump administration approved the delivery of 3,350 long-range missiles, extended-range attack munitions, paid for by Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway. At the same time, delayed further economic sanctions against Russia. The chances of a truce in the short term, though, seem remote. As a first step, Russia is saying that if Ukraine relinquishes all of the Donbass, including the Donetsk fortress belt that Ukraine still holds, then Russia will agree to the front line being frozen in place elsewhere. For its part, Ukraine remains unwilling to cede any of its sovereign territory, including the Donbass and Crimea, to Russia. Longer term, Russia is demanding a resolution of the underlying issues that it says led to the war in the first place, namely NATO's eastward expansion towards and up to the international borders of the Russian Federation. It is also difficult to avoid the impression that Putin is using peace talks as a ploy to avoid new US sanctions and, by offering peace terms known to be unacceptable to Ukraine, to avoid meaningful ceasefire negotiations while continuing the war. Turning now to the fighting itself, Russia continues to hold the upper hand in the war on land, but its spring-summer offensive is making slow progress. It increased the tempo in early August in the lead-up to Putin's the 15th of August meeting with Trump. Ukraine continues to hold the upper hand in the war at sea, but with the Western Black Sea essentially a Ukrainian lake and Ukraine's sea lines of communication open to mercantile trade, especially the vital grain exports, Ukraine is not pushing further east. Hence, with slow progress on land and a stalemate at sea, both sides are placing increased emphasis on missile and drone attacks on the opponent's cities and strategic infrastructure. Since early May, Russia has substantially increased the tempo of its now nightly drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, and the tempo increased further in July and August. Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, are bearing the brunt of Putin's displeasure that Ukraine is still defending its territory and in retaliation for Ukraine's successful drone and missile attacks on Russia, especially its airfields and oil installations. In late August and early September, the magnitude of the drone and missile attacks seemingly increased nightly, culminating on 6th and 7th of September when 810 drones and 13 missiles struck Kiev in the largest such attack of the war to date. At least 4 people were killed, and the government building which houses the Ukrainian cabinet and ministerial offices was struck for the first time and left smoldering. There also were 9 missile hits and 56 drone strikes in 37 locations across Ukraine, while debris from downed drones and missiles fell on 8 locations, according to Ukrainian officials. On hearing of this attack, an angry President Trump warned he was ready to impose further sanctions against Russia. Part of the reason for the slow progress of Russia's ground offensive is that all along the 1,200 kilometers front line, Ukraine has established close drone surveillance to a depth of 15 kilometers, enabling artillery and drone strikes on advancing Russian forces, whether in small groups or larger formations. Russian progress is largely dependent on electronic jamming of the Ukrainian drones. In northeastern Ukraine, Ukraine's 7-month cross-border incursion from its Sumy Oblast into Russia's Kursk Oblast, which began on the 6th of August, 2024, and at its peak had seized over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, had ended by the 16th of March, 2025. The last Ukrainian forces withdrew from Kursk Oblast to new defensive positions along the Sumy-Kursk border. Since then, there has been continuing skirmishing along the border. Ukrainian forces also invaded Belgorod Oblast in March-April and now hold some isolated pockets along the international border, but Ukraine now will be unable to use its occupation of significant Russian territory as a bargaining chip in any peace negotiations. Over summer, border skirmishing in northern Sumy and Kharkov Oblasts has seen tactical gains by each side. By the 8th of September, with the fighting continuing, Russia had gained some pockets of Ukrainian territory along the international border in both oblasts. In eastern Kharkiv Oblast on the 8th of September, Ukrainian forces were reported to have made substantial tactical gains to retake Russian-occupied territory and were advancing on Kupiansk, a key communications node currently in Russian hands. As to the fighting along the 1,000 kilometers front line in eastern and southern Ukraine, by early June, Russia's spring-summer offensive had made some progress. Each side was making marginal tactical gains at various places, but overall, the Russians had the better of the fighting and were expanding the amount of territory they control. On the eastern axis, Russia has been seeking to capture all of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, Ukraine's industrial heartland. Luhansk Oblast is now largely in Russian hands. In Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces have been advancing slowly westwards towards the strategic city of Pokrovsk and to the south of the city towards Donetsk's border with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. On the 8th of June, Russian forces reached the Dnipropetrovsk border in southern Donetsk, but key parts of western and central Donetsk remain in Ukrainian hands. Importantly, these include the so-called Donetsk fortress belt of cities and towns north of Pokrovsk, which runs in a 50 km north-south line along the H20 Kostiantynivka-Sloviansk highway. Analysts suggest that to seize the fortress belt could take the Russians several years. On the 1st of August, Russian forces captured Chasiv Yar, a key city in central Donetsk, after 16 months of fighting. Russian pressure will now build further on Pokrovsk. While Russian forces had closed up to Pokrovsk from the south several months ago, there has been a tactical stalemate around the city which is not cut off and remains in Ukrainian hands. For months, Ukrainian forces have picked off Russian soldiers by the thousand around Pokrovsk using small drones armed with bombs to tie down a numerically superior force. Now, though, Russian troops are creeping forward probing for weak spots in Ukraine's defenses, and in late July some Russian soldiers entered Pokrovsk for the first time. While Pokrovsk remains in Ukrainian hands for the time being, Ukrainian officials reported on the 6th of September that Russia was regrouping and reinforcing its troops in western Donetsk, likely ahead of a new major offensive. Given Russia's primary focus is in the Donbass, it is concentrated mainly on consolidating its earlier gains on the southern axis. Russian forces have sought to maintain their frontline positions in Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, with their main southern axis offensive operations continuing to be in western Zaporizhia, where they continue to assault using small infantry groups together with motorcycle teams. Here they employ a wave tactic, sending 4 to 5 motorcycles to find gaps in Ukrainian defenses and then follow up with dismounted infantry to consolidate positions. Russia now holds some 3/4 of Zaporizhia, and Ukrainian military analysts estimate that the Russians have accumulated as many as 70,000 troops along the Zaporizhia front, plus hundreds of tanks and artillery. In summary, on the eastern axis, the Russian advance to Pokrovsk and south of it to the Dnipropetrovsk border is the most notable change in control of the front line for several months, but analysts say innovative tactics by Ukrainian forces, combining the use of drones and ground forces, have inflicted significant losses on Russian forces and slowed their offensive. On the southern axis, there is a stalemate as in the war at sea. Israel-Gaza war. In a major escalation of the war and against the advice of the Chief of the General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, General Eyal Zamir, on the 7th of August, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved a plan for the IDF to take over and occupy Gaza City. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Gaza City is a Hamas stronghold and capturing it is necessary to defeat the Palestinian Islamist militants. Hence, the principal focus over the past month has been on how this decision would be implemented. The IDF estimated that it could take several months to undertake the military occupation of Gaza City, as it would involve urban counter-guerrilla warfare amongst closely packed multi-story buildings under which a maze of tunnels had been constructed for guerrilla use, most difficult terrain in which to conduct military operations. Further, the Palestinian guerrilla fighters, Hamas and others, could be expected to defend their territory tenaciously, notwithstanding the depletion of their leadership ranks, the heavy expenditure of ammunition, weapons, and equipment, and heavy casualties experienced after nearly 2 years of continuous fighting. IDF casualties could be high and difficult to sustain. Compounding this, the city was occupied by hundreds of thousands of civilians, many of them already having been displaced more than once and currently experiencing a humanitarian crisis of hunger, disease, and inadequate health and hospital facilities. They would be reluctant to move again. On the 19th of August, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz approved an IDF plan for the capture and occupation of Gaza City. An IDF official described the plan as a gradual, precise, and targeted operation in and around Gaza City, with troops entering some areas where they had not gone previously. 5 divisions were expected to take part in the offensive. It would involve as preliminary moves the mobilization of IDF reservists and the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians from Gaza City to shelters in southern Gaza. On the 20th of August, the IDF announced the call-up 60,000 reservists ahead of the planned ground offensive to capture and occupy all of Gaza City. The reservists were to report for duty in September. The IDF said this was part of the preparations for the next phase of Operation Gideon's Chariots, the ground offensive that it launched in May and has seen it take control of at least 75% of Gaza. In addition, 20,000 reservists who had already been called up would receive a notice extending their current orders. Most of the troops mobilized for the offensive, though, would be active duty personnel. These troops had been operating in the Zaytun and Jabalia areas, outer suburbs of Gaza City, as part of the preparations for the plan. In fact, the military had been carrying out heavy strikes on the city for weeks, with infantry and tanks advancing through outer suburbs, and by the 4th of September its forces were pushing into Sheikh Radwan, one of the city's largest and most crowded neighborhoods within a few kilometers of the city center. The IDF said it had control over almost half of the city. On the 6th of September, the IDF announced that it was establishing a humanitarian area in southern Gaza at Al-Mawasin near Khan Yunis. See map. The new humanitarian area will include infrastructure such as field hospitals, water pipelines, desalination facilities, and food supplies. Humanitarian efforts in the zone will continue on an ongoing basis in cooperation with the UN and international organizations, in parallel to the expansion of the ground operation. The IDF spokesperson urged residents in Gaza City to evacuate south. The UN estimates there are about 1 million people in and around Gaza City, warning of a coming disaster if the Israeli military goes ahead with its plans to seize the city. Many of those now in Gaza City were displaced earlier in the war only to return later. Some residents have said that they refuse to be displaced again. On the 6th of September, the IDF bombed a high-rise tower in Gaza City that it said was being used by Hamas, and also said that civilians in the area were warned in advance. On the 9th of September, the IDF said it had now demolished 50 high-rise towers in the city. It would now ramp up airstrikes on Gaza in a mighty hurricane, to serve as a last warning to Hamas that it will destroy the enclave unless fighters accept a demand from US President Donald Trump to free all hostages and surrender. The IDF then issued a new evacuation order for the entire Gaza City and warned of a major attack as part of the occupation plan. The IDF spokesman said the Israeli army is determined to eliminate Hamas and will operate in the Gaza City area with great force, as it has operated in various parts of the Gaza Strip. He called on the residents to evacuate immediately via the Al-Rashid Street towards the humanitarian zone in Al-Mawasi. Remaining in the area is extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, strong international opposition to the Gaza City operation is mounting. Several countries, including Britain, France, Canada, and Australia, have announced their intention to conditionally recognize a Palestinian state at the 80th session of the UN General Assembly in New York this month, 9 to 29 September 2025. This diplomatic effort aims to advance the two-state solution and comes after a high-level conference in July 2025 to discuss the peaceful settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The move also reflects significant international momentum for a resolution of the Palestinian question. The ultimate success of these diplomatic moves may devolve on the achievement or otherwise of United States concurrence. In breaking news as we went to press, Israel is reported to have bombed a meeting of Hamas's top leaders in Qatar's capital, Doha, on the 9th of September, as they were said to be gathered to discuss a new US-sponsored hostage ceasefire proposal aimed at ending the war in Gaza. The gathering was believed to include all of Hamas's top leadership outside Gaza, including the leader of Hamas's Gaza units, Khalil al-Hayya, Zaha Jabrin, who leads Hamas in the West Bank, Mohammed Darwish, the head of Hamas's Shura Council, Nizar Awadallah, a member of the Hamas Political Bureau in the Gaza Strip, and Khaled Mashal, the head of Hamas abroad. Reports differ as to whether the attack was successful. Israel was said to be increasingly optimistic about the results of the strike, which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said could open the door to the immediate end of the war. Hamas, by contrast, said the strike had been a failure. Qatar, a staunch US ally which, with Egypt and the US, has been mediating peace talks between Israel and Hamas, was outraged. Israel's actions would appear to have ended diplomatic efforts to end the conflict, at least for the immediate future. Yemen, the Houthi insurgency. In Yemen, after a pronounced lull, Houthi rebel forces resumed missile attacks on Israel during late August. The 22nd of August saw the first use of cluster munitions delivered by missile. On the 24th of August, Israel responded, targeting the Houthis' military and energy infrastructure. These strikes were followed on the 28th of August with attacks on the Houthis' political leadership in the Houthis' capital of Sana'a in northwest Yemen in an apparent attempt to cut the head off the snake. These attacks killed 12 key officials including the Houthi Prime Minister, Ahmed al-Rahawi, and 9 other Houthi government ministers. All are said to have been replaced. This led to the Houthis arresting all UN personnel on suspicion of spying for the US or Israel. On the 3rd and the 4th of September, the Houthis resumed attacks on Israel with further missile and drone strikes. The Houthis also claimed to have targeted an Israeli tanker in the northern Red Sea area. All missiles are reported to have fallen short or have been intercepted, lending credence to the suggestion that Israel strikes may have degraded the Houthi targeting ability. International reports suggest that the missile targeting the tanker fell short, but there are reports of significant electronic interference in the area suggesting countermeasures in operation. The legitimate Yemeni government was also active during the month, continuing seizures of weapon precursors such as drones, jet propulsion units, wireless devices, and advanced control components at its ports. Shipments appeared to have originated in Djibouti, and personnel seized originated mainly in Iran, with some from Somalia and one Indian national. The US Africa Command congratulated Yemen on its success using the term Yemeni partners, which might imply US intelligence involvement. Separately, a Yemeni spokesman accused the Houthis of setting up chemical warfare manufacturing facilities under the direct supervision and management of Iranian advisors. The capture of precursors, in part, being responsible for this claim. Somalia, counter-insurgency operations. The long-running international counter-insurgency operations continue in Somalia against Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, simply known as al-Shabaab, or by its state name, the Islamic Emirate of Somalia, which is a Sunni Islamist militant and political movement. United States forces carried out 5 airstrikes in Somalia in the period 1 to 8 September in support of ground operations by Somali and Ugandan forces of the African Mission. The US Africa Command report on the strikes used the term partner forces. Local media reported that, as a result, Somali, and Ugandan forces had captured the town of Bariaya after a week of heavy fighting. Al-Shabaab is said to have suffered heavily, losing 120 killed, over 100 wounded and dozens more captured, as well as abandoning its weapons. This is regarded as part of a continuing uptick in US operations in Somalia. India. Armed Forces Development Plan. India has unveiled a 15-year development plan entitled Technology Vision and Capability Roadmap for its armed forces and industry. It includes such transformative technologies as nuclear propulsion, hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, and space-based warfare. For the Army, it will see the acquisition of 1,800 next-generation main battle tanks, 400 networked light tanks for mountain warfare, 50,000 vehicle-mounted anti-tank guided missiles, and 600,000 artillery rounds. The Navy is planned to receive a third aircraft carrier powered by nuclear propulsion with electromagnetic catapults, as well as 4 amphibious assault ships, LHDs, and 17 advanced escorts. Additional submarines are also on the list. The Air Force is looking at large numbers of drones and unmanned platforms, as well as 500 hypersonic missiles. One interesting acquisition will be the development of the world's first 12,000-kilometer class strategic stealth bomber. Indian reports note that it deliberately has a third longer range than the American B-21 Raider bomber and would be capable of one-way unrefueled operations against continental United States. In all, over 200 advanced weapon systems across the services are planned. As much of this is still thought and not in existence, it will be interesting to see if India can develop it within the time period. The entry into service of so much new and experimental products will also require careful management. Clearly, India is beginning to state long-term strategic ambitions in the Indian Ocean area. The Congo, the M23 insurgency. For several months, we have been following the M23 insurgency in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. As background, for the past 3 decades, there has been an on-and-off conflict in the Kivu region of the DRC in the country's east. The Kivu region shares a border with Rwanda and Burundi. The conflict involves ethnic tensions between Hutus, supported by Burundi, and Tutsis, supported by Rwanda, conflated with conflicts over mineral wealth, among other things. Tutsis, who were the target of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, are an ethnic minority in the Congo, but have a notable presence in the Kivu region. North Kivu and South Kivu provinces are rich in minerals such as coltan, which is used to make components in smartphones and laptops. It is now a valuable commodity on the global market, and many players have an interest in exploiting such minerals, legally or illegally, not least the Rwandan government of President Paul Kagame. Most recently, the principal opposition to the Congolese government in Kivu has come from the March 23 movement, usually referred to as M23, a Tutsi militia. M23 receives military and other support from the Rwandan government, which uses M23 illegally to exploit Kivu's mineral resources. M23 has become quite professional both militarily and as civil administrators in territory it has seized. M23 also is now part of a larger rebel coalition, the Congo River Alliance, AFC, that opposes the Congolese government in the eastern Congo. On the government side is the Congolese Army, known as FARDC, the military of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The army is assisted by United Nations, UN, and Southern African Development Community peacekeepers. It is also supported by the FDLR, Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, an ethnic Hutu militia, whose members committed the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and other pro-government militias such as the Wasalendo, a pro-government rebel coalition. The current fighting in the Kivu region was initiated by M23 in 2022, when M23 launched a major military offensive which has been ongoing since then at varying levels of intensity, and for which the Rwandan government has supplied weapons, ammunition, other material, and troops. Following a lengthy pause, the The offensive was resumed in October 2024 and ramped up dramatically in January 2025, when M23 seized large amounts of territory in both Kivu provinces. In a major battle between the 23rd and the 30th of January, M23 captured Goma, the capital of North Kivu, forcing relocation of the provincial government to a temporary capital. There followed a reduction in the fighting initially as M23 consolidated its territorial gains, instituted civil administrations in its new territories, and intensified its mining activities. Nevertheless, authorities say some further 7,000 people had been killed in fighting by June. The DRC government blames Rwanda for the conflict in Kivu. Diplomatic relations between the Congo and Rwanda broke down on the 24th of January, leading the expulsion of Rwandan diplomats from Kinshasa and the recall of DRC diplomats from Rwanda. United Nations sources estimated that between 500 and 1,000 Rwandan troops assisted M23 in the Goma area. On the 27th of January, Congolese and Rwandan troops exchanged fire across their border near Goma. There are fears the Kivu conflict could spread into a wider regional war, given the presence of Rwandan and Burundi troops in the Kivu provinces. Somewhat surprisingly then, in March, Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi and his Rwandan counterpart Paul Kagame met in Doha and reaffirmed their commitment to an unconditional ceasefire. This led to peace talks between the DRC government and the M23 rebels mediated by Qatar. On the 23rd of April, after a week of talks that both sides described as frank and constructive, the DRC government and the M23 rebels agreed to halt the fighting until the peace talks mediated by Qatar reached their conclusion. The peace talks in Doha notwithstanding, local conflicts continued in eastern Congo, with further villages falling to the M23 rebels in April and May. On the 27th of June, Rwanda and the DRC signed a bilateral peace agreement in Washington, followed on the 19th of July by a so-called Doha Declaration between the DRC government and M23 rebel leaders, which committed both sides to a ceasefire and further negotiation. Humanitarian NGOs, however, say little has changed on the ground. There has been a surge in brutal attacks on civilians by armed groups. At least 319 civilians were killed by M23 fighters, aided by members of the Rwanda Defense Force, between the 9th and the 21st of July in North Kivu province. Most of the victims, including at least 48 women and 19 children, were local farmers camping in their fields during the planting season. On the 5th of September, the UN Human Rights Office said the M23, the Congolese armed forces and other armed groups had committed serious rights violations in eastern DRC that may amount to war crimes. The growing insecurity is fueling one of the world's most acute humanitarian crises. According to UN figures, over 7.8 million people are now internally displaced in eastern DRC, while 28 million people are facing food insecurity, including nearly 4 million at emergency levels. Adding to the strain, more than 30,000 refugees from South Sudan have fled into the DRC's Ituri province since April, escaping a wave of killings and active hostilities. Cambodia-Thailand border conflict. In late July, a 4-day war broke out between Cambodia and Thailand along their shared border. The origins of disagreement between Cambodia and Thailand about the alignment of their shared border, however, date back over a century to French colonial days, and specifically to the Franco-Siamese Border Treaty of 1904 and an associated 1907 French map delimiting the border. Since Cambodian independence from France in 1952, there have been many border disputes between Cambodia and Thailand, generally centered on important Hindu temples claimed by communities on both sides of the border, a notable case in point being the Temple of Priya Vihir, which is located in the Dangrik Mountains, which form a natural boundary between the two nations at the eastern end of the border. Periodically, these disputes have led to armed skirmishes and more serious conflict. Cambodia has referred the border delimitation or alignment dispute related to the Temple of Priya Vihir to the International Court of Justice, ICJ, on 2 occasions, 1962 and 2013, and obtained judgments in its favor, but Thailand has not accepted the court's decisions. The border dispute remains unresolved, and Thailand has stationed troops at the temple. Many of the border disputes are complex. In the case of the Temple of Priya Vihar, the original temple on the site, a strategic mountain top on the border, was built by the Khmer Empire in the 9th century, so the ICJ ruled it belonged to Cambodia, but the most direct route of access to it is via the Thai side of the border, which the court also acknowledged. While the disagreements remain extant, there had been an absence of conflict over the past decade. This changed earlier this year when tensions increased in several disputed areas along the border, with a skirmish on the 28th of May in the area of the Chongbok Pass through the Dangrek Mountains in which one Cambodian was killed. Following several more diplomatic and political incidents, one of which led to the suspension of the Thai Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra by the country's constitutional court, the crisis broke out into open armed conflict on the 24th of July. 5 days of fierce fighting followed before Thailand and Cambodia agreed to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire to come into effect at midnight on the 28th of July local time. The ceasefire was brokered by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, in his capacity as current chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, in the presence of diplomats from China and the United States. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet and Thailand's acting Prime Minister Phumtham Wechayachai both hailed the outcome, noting that there had been many killed and injured on both sides and that some 300,000 refugees, 140,000 Cambodians and 160,000 Thais, had fled the fighting. Since the ceasefire came into effect, Cambodia-Thailand border talks have continued in Kuala Lumpur, focused on implementing the ceasefire and improving communication between the two armies. Importantly, it has been agreed that an ASEAN observation team led by Malaysia will monitor the ceasefire. As of the 7th of August, the ceasefire is reported to remain fragile and troops continue to build up on both sides of the border. Many refugees deem it is not yet safe to return home. Over the past month, while the ceasefire has held overall, sporadic armed confrontations have occurred and Thai soldiers have been injured by Cambodian landmines. Both countries have accused the other of violating the ceasefire agreement. The Royal Thai Army seems to have provoked citizens on both sides of the border and has declared martial law in several border provinces. In doing so, elements of the army appear to be throwing out a challenge to the civilian government during a time of political crisis. On the 29th of August, the Constitutional Court of Thailand formally removed Paetongtarn Shinawatra from office as Prime Minister after finding that she had violated ethics in a private phone call with Cambodian Senate President Hun Sen on the 15th of June, the contents of which were later leaked. Indeed, Hun Sen seems to have been playing a very clever game of asymmetric information warfare against Thailand and fomenting Thailand's constitutional crisis. This has created a perception that Cambodia is more agile, assertive, and media savvy, leaving Thailand always one step behind.